All right, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'd like to get started here, and this is the second of the Protecting Our Lakes Shorelands speaker series, and today's event is Inland Lake Fish Habitats and Fisheries in a Changing Environment. Dr. Joe Nohner is here from the DNR Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. So it's being hosted by Friends of the Spider Lake and Rennie Lake Associations, and its organizer is Carol Kusel and Ralph Bednars and Patty Hirschberger. So as host here, I'd like to welcome everybody, and sorry again for this little, I guess, a mix up on the technology, but we'll get going and we'll get through this. So welcome everyone. We're going to get started here. My name is Steve Largent. I serve as the Conservation Team Coordinator for the Grand Traverse Conservation District here in Traverse City, Michigan. I've been with the Conservation District for over 28 years. I grew up on Spider Lake next door to Carroll, and I have a degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, and am a certified Michigan natural shoreline professional. I've spent a majority of my professional career restoring and protecting the Boardman River. Before we dive in, I just wanted to let everyone know this presentation is being recorded and will be posted publicly at a later date. And we'll keep all participants muted and the video turned off throughout the presentation. If everyone could go ahead and open the chat box and send us your name and city you're calling from, that would be greatly appreciated, so we can have a good understanding of our listener demographics. So if you would, please fill in where you're from and with your name. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and I will try my best to relay them to Ralph and the other speakers. At the very end, we will also have a few minutes for any remaining questions. As I mentioned, I work for the Grand Traverse Conservation District, and I wanted to share a bit of our background and what we do here. Then I'll hand it off to Carol. The Conservation District was established in 1941 during the Dust Bowl days to provide farmers the knowledge and resources to implement better cultivation practices. Today, the same idea is heard throughout our mission, while at the same time, it has been expanded to include a wide range of programs, including the Boardman River Nature Center, in order to instill and promote the idea of conservation in all generations. We were previously an unfunded entity until 2018, when the people of Grand Traverse County voted in a millage, which has helped tremendously with our day-to-day operations. We are truly blessed to have our Conservation District offices housed within the Boardman River Nature Center here on the Grand Traverse County's Natural Education Reserve. The Natural Education Reserve encompasses over 500 acres along the Boardman River. Before COVID, our education department operated almost exclusively from the Nature Center, which included Nature Day camps and field trips for area youth to partake in and indulge themselves in nature and conservation by utilizing the several miles of trails located directly behind the Nature Center and along the Boardman River. It's also the location where Sabin Dam was removed in 2018. Sabin Dam was the third and the final former hydro dam to be removed from the Boardman River as part of the largest dam removal effort in Michigan's history. Besides restoring and protecting the Boardman River and its 287 square mile watershed, the Conservation District is home to numerous other programs, including restoration through management of invasive species with the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. We instill and foster exploration of our natural world through our Parklands program, which features 3,000 acres of public parklands throughout Grand Traverse County. And we promote agricultural assistance through MEAP, which is the Michigan Agricultural Environmental Assurance Program. We also assist farmers by providing produce safety guidelines through our Michigan On-Farm Produce Safety Program. And finally, we share a forester with 2 neighboring conservation districts who works through the Forestry Assistance Program to provide support for private landowners regarding proper woodland stewardship. So once COVID-19 is behind us, there are a few ways in which the community can get involved with our work and missions, such as volunteering at the Nature Center as a docent or participating in a district event or program, or simply promote sustainable and responsible enjoyment of the outdoors. Another way to become involved is to sign up as a trail steward. Trail stewards are our eyes on the trails that report down trees, erosion issues, and other parkland concerns. And lastly, consider donating to the Conservation District on our website or becoming a friend of the district by visiting natureiscalling.org/support. So with that, I'd like to get started. And if you have any questions about the Grand Traverse Conservation District, just please feel free to send them to info@gtcd.org. And from here, I'll hand it on to Carol.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much for that very informative summary of all the good work that the Grand Traverse Conservation District does. Also, thank you for moderating our program today. My screen, before I go on here, just with some technicalities here, my screen and I believe Patty's screen is just showing the five of our faces. And so we need to get back to the Grand Traverse slides and the poll slides, and then eventually Joe Nohner, Dr. Joe Nohner will take over. So if you'll check on that as I progress here, I'd appreciate that. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second annual Protecting Our Lakes and Shorelands information series. We often refer to it as the poll series. A little bit less of a mouthful there. Also on the screen with us is Steve Largent from Grand Traverse Conservation District, myself, Ralph Bednarz, and Patty Hersberger, and our speaker, Joe Nohner. Over 2 years ago, my friends and fellow riparians, or my friend and fellow riparian, Patty Hersberger, and I began discussing ways to connect experts in our little corner of the Northwest Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And we wanted to connect those people with riparians like ourselves and other people who are water quality supporters. Our primary goals are twofold. One was to provide information to learn more about our lakes and waterway ecosystems, and two, to encourage folks to take that information and make at least one change in their actions to support our local lakes and shorelands. This year, our audience has expanded from our little corner of up north Michigan. That expansion or expanded participation is due to the Grand Traverse Conservation District. You see, last year during our polls 2019 series, Katie Grzyziak, the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Coordinator, was one of our speakers. She is connected with the Grand Traverse Conservation District. And so when we went looking for a host this year, Katie quickly and very skillfully connected the Grand Traverse Conservation District and our polls organizing team. We're very grateful to them for hosting us this year. So speaking of last year, Ralph Bednarz was a participant in the poll series. He is a retired limnologist with the Michigan DNR. And he and Patty and I are very grateful that he not only volunteered to join our polls organizing team, but very quickly and also skillfully organized our speakers for this year. Ralph, will you please introduce our speaker for today?
Yes, thanks, Carol. Before I do that, though, I want to remind Steve that we need to be recording this. I hope that is being recorded.
Yes, we are.
So great. So I'm pleased to be part of the 2020 poll series. I've met and worked with many special people in my career, and we have 3 very talented people scheduled to educate us during the 2020 poll series. Last month, if you were on the series, we learned about aquatic plants from Dr. Joe Lattimore. And today we will learn about inland lake fish habitats and fisheries from Dr. Joe Nohner. Dr. Nohner works for the Department of Natural Resources in the Fisheries Division's Habitat Management Unit. He coordinates the Midwest Glacier Lakes Partnership, which conducts research, education and outreach, and conservation projects to understand and benefit fish habitat in the inland lakes of the upper Midwest. He also serves as the inland lake habitat expert for the DNR, as well as serving as the Fisheries Division lead on climate change, its liaison to the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and its representative to numerous partnerships focused on inland lake management throughout the state. Dr. Nohner received his MS degree from the University of Michigan and his Ph.D. from Michigan State. His research interests focus on the relationships between fish, fish habitats, and people on inland lakes and multiple spatial scales. Please help us provide a warm Northern Michigan welcome to Dr. Nohner. Joe, the virtual stage is yours.
Thanks, Ralph. I'm going to pull up my screen here. Okay, should be able to see the PowerPoint slides.
Not yet. Let me, yeah, not yet.
I've got the screen sharing going and it's showing the PowerPoint slide.
All right. There we go. Can everybody see it?
I do.
Okay, good. All
We'll
right.
get started then.
Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you to everyone for inviting me to speak this morning. And I know that we've had a couple of technical difficulties, and so we've got a limited audience here this morning. But I also understand that there was quite a few registrations coming into this presentation, and so I'll offer at the outset that if anybody has questions about my presentation, I have my contact information at the end of the slides. And so if you're watching this on a recorded video, you're more than welcome to reach out to me in person, and we can have a conversation about anything that we've discussed here or more. So this is something that I'm enthusiastic about and I'm ready and excited to talk about. So thank you to the organizers for putting together this series, and let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about inland lake fish habitats and fisheries in a changing environment. And really what I'm going to focus on is climate change and how climate change affects our lakes, although there are many interconnected factors here. So an outline of what I'll discuss today. First, I'm just going to start with the basics of what is fish habitat. We'll talk a little bit about how climate is changing globally and then how it's affecting Michigan and Michigan lakes. We'll work through how we expect climate to change fish habitat, fish populations, and fisheries. And then we'll finish out with some concrete actions that riparians and other stakeholders can do, because I don't want to have a presentation that's all doom and gloom without leaving us with some solutions and steps forward as we go. So first, I'd like to give a little bit of a primer on fish habitat. Fish habitat is often viewed by folks that may not fish as much or and may not have studied fisheries as simply the place where fish live, and they may not be taking into consideration all of the different effects from habitat that the aspects of habitat that affect fish. So fish habitat includes physical, chemical, and biological aspects of all of the places that fish live throughout their lives. So what are some examples of those? Of course, you've got physical. This is the first thing that comes to people's mind when they think of habitat. You've got refuge from predators provided by things like large woody debris. You've got vegetation and wood, which provide, for example, a substrate for laying eggs. But you also have temperature. So water temperature is one of the key drivers of fish populations. And oxygen. Just like us, fish need oxygen in order to live and respire. And so they need oxygen in the water, and that's a critical component. And then, of course, they need food. Here I've shown Daphnia, which is a zooplankton. It's a small crustacean that floats around in the water and is critical for yellow perch, like the one I've shown here, during their early life history stages. And so thinking about how the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of habitat are available to fishes throughout their life histories, whether that's in the lake or potentially swimming up a river or into a wetland as they complete their life histories, is critical. And in the context of climate change and global change, we need to think about these broad scales. So I'll try to talk through some of the examples of fish habitat, and I'll first start with the microhabitat scale. So this is, when you're an angler, like the boater right here, you're probably thinking about, where do I want to go fishing? And you're trying to assess fish habitat from that perspective. And in that perspective, a lot of it is, where are fish going to aggregate? Where are they going to, what places within the lake are they going to use? And you can see that there's a bathymetric feature here that provides a little bit of structure. There are these docks. And so a lot of the threats that we see at this scale come from things like seawalls. They come from things like the loss of large woody habitat. These trees would typically fall into the water and remain in the water, but they're increasingly being removed or not planted along the shoreline, so that they aren't providing that habitat. Dredging, and then aquatic vegetation removal. So there's no aquatic vegetation along the littoral zone within this shoreline. And I don't know whether there should be naturally or not, but we do see aquatic vegetation removal commonly within our lakes. And so these are the things that are threatening habitats at a microhabitat scale, a local scale. But then if you zoom out a little bit, you can also think about things that are driving habitat at the lake scale. So within the entire lake, you've got unnaturally high nutrient levels, you've got invasive species, and you've got lake scale herbicide treatments like fluoridone treatments that are changing the way the lake functions. Zooming out even further, now you've got the watershed. And the watershed is just all of the land area that drains into a lake. And so here you've got Houghton Lake's watershed, and this perspective really helps us to look at all of the potential sources for those nutrient levels that are occurring within the lake. So it may be that you've got agriculture or urban development within the watershed that's exporting extra nutrients into the watershed, which eventually flow down into the lake. You've got obstructions that may be limiting the ability of fishes in the lake to swim up the creeks and access other habitats, wetlands or other lakes that they might otherwise access. And so these are things that at the watershed scale may be affecting your lake. And then finally, we've got, of course, the global scale. The global climate system is responsible for setting the temperature, the rainfall within your lake that drive the lake levels and that drive the fish populations. And of course, those things are changing with climate, and we'll come back and talk about those a little bit later. But it's important to note that there are other things that the global scale drives. For example, contaminants. We have deposition of heavy metals within our lakes, deposition of nutrients, and it's not as big of a factor for our lakes here in Michigan as it is for, say, freestone creeks in Pennsylvania, but acid rain. So I've talked a little bit about the various scales that affect fish habitat, and I'm going to take a little bit of a moment just to think about how those operate together. And so we've got the climate scale, the watershed scale, the shoreline scale, and the inland lake habitat scale. And all of these are affecting one another. So I've noted that this is the oversimplified version because I could really draw arrows among all of these boxes. And so these are what we would think of as the natural ecosystem that that's driving what's happening in our lakes. But of course, people are intimately connected with all of these systems, whether it's climate or whether it's the watershed, the shoreline for riparian property owners, or even the inland lake habitat or in lake habitat. And so, and then of course, people are catching fish. So all of these things are really interconnected, and it would be a bit myopic to not consider all of these various components of what's happening in a lake and how they're connected if you were interested in the effects of climate and climate change on fishes. And so fishes is the why of the conversation here. That's what brings us here to think about habitat changes to inland lakes, and that's what drives much of my research and my work within the Fisheries Division of the Department of Natural Resources. But if you really want to get at the heart of what's happening to fish populations, you need to think about all of this other stuff, and so it's much bigger. Okay, so that's the first break, just going through fish habitat. And as I said, I've got the 4 main points that I'm going to go through here today laid out, and then at each break I'll try to highlight the main points that I want you to take away from those sections. And so just remember, fish habitat isn't just large woody debris or aquatic vegetation. It includes all of these physical, chemical, and biological aspects throughout the life history of a fish, and it's connected to human ecological systems. So I'll stop here and just take a pause. Are there any questions about fish habitat or how fish habitat is affected by humans broadly? We'll get into more details later.
Nothing has come in, Joe, to the chat box, but I do have a question. I mean, you touched on it, that the waterfront property is the greatest source for that nearshore habitat through trees and you know, successional habitat with those that die and fall into the lake. But that's often removed by property owners wanting to improve, you know, the looks of their property. How do you handle such I guess, a dichotomy of where property owners want a clean look, but yet you have that habitat that's so critical to nearshore, you know, fish?
Well, the immediate actions that we would be talking about, of course, are planting more trees along the shoreline and encouraging property owners to allow those trees that do fall to remain in the water, or to add additional trees that they might do through a habitat restoration. But getting to the people side of that equation, of course, part of that comes down to educating and providing information that those trees are serving a function for the ecosystem, whether your property owner is an angler, whether they're interested in turtle habitat or bird habitat. All of us that own properties on the shoreline are managing our properties based on our own aesthetics and what we want to see out of shoreline property and our values and our definition of beauty. And so those definitions of beauty are different for every person. And I think, you know, one of the critical things is helping people to understand the functions that those structures are providing from a wave energy perspective, from a wildlife and fish habitat perspective, and in assisting the lake and having a more natural ecology.
Another question just came in that says, are there state-supported programs that support fish habitat enhancement for property owners and that you know of?
Yeah, so I'm going to defer that question to a little bit later. I've got a whole page of resources. So I think the answer is yes. The DNR Fisheries Habitat Grant is one example, but I'll go through those in a little bit more detail later.
And I have one, you know, just follow-up question. As far as, let's say there is a dead tree that's, instead of removing it, can you cut it down and let it drop into the lake? Or does it have to fall naturally?
It needs to fall naturally. If you're cutting it down actively and placing it in the lake, then it would require a permit from EGLE, the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And they've got a minor permit category specifically for fish habitats like that, that's designed to make it really easy for somebody that's trying to do the right thing. So if somebody's interested in doing that sort of a restoration project, even if it's just one tree, reach out to your EGLE district office and they'll be able to get you situated, and they'll help you along the way because you're trying to do a good thing there.
All right, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to keep moving then. So we're going to go into climate change and how climate change is affecting fish habitats and lakes in Michigan. And so the Earth's climate is changing. And we know that from a number of studies. I'm not really going to spend a ton of time focusing on the causes for that change or laying out the case for why it is changing. I'll refer to things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports as really good sources of information for that. But I just want to show, at least one slide that shows that temperatures relative to the global average across since 1980 or 1880, excuse me, have been rising consistently. And for somebody born in 1980, they've never experienced a cooler than average year across the globe, which is a pretty amazing thing to think about. And so temperatures are rising, and that's the thing that I think most people know about climate change, that global temperatures are rising. But climate change is more nuanced than just temperatures and just a global average. Climate change also varies by the local geography, and it's not just the temperature. It's also things like precipitation, drought, wind, et cetera, et cetera. Our climate is an interconnected system. And so I've got some examples here from Jeff Andreessen, who's the Michigan State climatologist. This is a person whose career is based on understanding and predicting the climate for people like farmers. So much more knowledgeable about climate specifically systems than me. And so he's put together a really helpful graph here that shows that in Michigan, the average annual temperature by year is increasing. And so we see about a 2 or 3 degree Fahrenheit increase between 1900 and present. But we also see a lot of variation. And so it's difficult sometimes within a given year to pinpoint whether this year is warmer because of climate change or whether it's warmer as a result of the natural variation that exists within the system. And taking a step back to look at the trend over the course of a century, I think helps to see that there is variation. That variation may be increasing in the temperatures, right? The spread is getting wider, but the average is increasing within Michigan. And so those warmer temperatures are playing out through various impacts to society. And if you're like me, you've got tomatoes growing outside, and you might be interested in things like the USDA plant hardiness zones. These zones describe which areas of the country are best for producing which types of plants and vegetables and crops. They're very, very important to farmers, for example. And the USDA consistently produces maps of these plant hardiness zones. And so you can see here that there's a map from 1990 and a map from 2015. And this mostly red map on top shows the difference between the maps from 1990 and 2015. And what we see is that in Michigan, in some zones, you have no change in the plant hardiness. And in some zones, you have, some areas, you have 2 zones of change. And so in general, across most of Michigan, you're seeing an increase in the zone to a more southerly zone. And so it's just another reflection of the growing conditions for plants and crops is changing within Michigan. I'm not going to go into a ton of predictions and models, but I do want to share one that I think really helps provide a visual and nail it down for me. It helps hit home for me. And so this was Catherine Hayhoe in 2010 produced this figure, and it looked at projections from Michigan's specifically climate into the future based on 2 different scenarios. So if you're not familiar with the global climate models, the biggest source of uncertainty within those models is which emissions scenario we think is going to occur. And the emissions scenarios are based on what humans decide to do as a society. Do we decide to lower our emissions? That's this yellow scenario. Or do we decide to do business as usual? That's the red scenario. And so what this graph shows, this figure shows is that you know, Michigan is going to be having a climate that's much more like southern Indiana and even Tennessee. No matter what we do, even if we have a low emissions scenario, and if we have a high emission scenario, if we continue our business as usual, we're going to be down in the Missouri range, at least the lower peninsula, or the Iowa range for the upper, or Oklahoma in 2080. And so when I think about this, I think of, I've got kids who are 1 and 3 years old, and when I'm thinking about these long-term predictions, I try to think about them in terms of what my kids are going to be doing when these things are occurring. And here they're going to be in their early adulthood, when Michigan is probably something like southern Illinois, and they're going to be then taking their grandkids fishing when Michigan is something like Oklahoma, potentially. So those are some really serious changes in our climate that we need to be considering as we move forward. But as I said, it's not just temperature. We're also talking about changes to precipitation. And so in the past century, we've seen precipitation increase. Again, you see a lot of variation in the amount of precipitation that we get in Michigan year to year, but you're seeing a general increase in precipitation of something like 4 inches of rain a year. But it's not even that simple. We also have increases in the number of wet days followed by wet days, and that's really important from a hydrological perspective because it means the ground is saturated and more water is running off into our streams and into our rivers. And so you see here that the number of wet days is increasing, that's this blue line, but also the number of wet days followed by wet days is increasing, that's this green line. And so again, this means more runoff, this means more saturated soils, and it has implications for our lakes and streams. It also means that, somewhat paradoxically, we are expecting to see droughts throughout the state, increasing in their frequency. And so this helps us to explain that seeming paradox in that our precipitation levels are increasing and our rain is becoming more clustered into large events that are interspersed by long periods of dry. And so we have both more drought and more heavy rain events occurring. I think often when people think about warming temperatures, they think about the summertime. Probably for me, that makes sense because I'm most uncomfortable about the heat in the summer. But importantly, these temperatures are also changing in the winter, and we see a substantial amount of change in the winter. And so I've just pulled up Traverse City. This is again Jeff Andreessen's slide. And it shows that historical trends, this blue line here shows the amount of average temperatures from 1951 to 1980 that were common in January. And then the lighter blue line shows that same distribution of temperatures from 1981 to 2010. And what this shows is that, one, the peaks are different. So this, there's about a 2.4 degrees Celsius increase in Traverse City in the average temperature in January, but also that the average temperature, you're seeing many more average temperatures in the 30-degree range than you would have typically from 1951 to 1980. And so while you may see the same number of Januaries that are cold, that are 10 degrees, most of those you're seeing a general shift upward. So increased variation and increase in temperature. And we know those now, those are living out through things like polar vortexes and these really unseasonably warm days that we have in the winter, where I find myself steelhead fishing with just a light jacket on. So what do these changes in temperatures have in terms of effects on our lakes? Well, I've pulled up some data from Steve Hamilton and some folks that he's partnered with down in Berry County on 2 lakes down there. And these are ice history records taken by lakefront property owners that show trends in ice cover duration. And so back in 1950, the small lake, Fair Lake, has a acreage, it's about 230 acres, 29 feet deep. Again, it's in Berry County. And back in 1955 or so, they were seeing about 120 days of ice every year. But if you zoom forward now to present day, they're more in the 90 days of ice every year. And so they've lost 33 days of ice for a typical year from 1955 to 2018. And that has significant effects for ice fishing, for plant growth, and for the growth of fish and aquatic fish, other aquatic animals. But that's not a isolated example, of course. Here's another nearby lake, also collected by Steve Hamilton and some of his collaborators on the lake, within the Lake Association. And this shows that, again, in Gull Lake from 1924 to present, they've lost about 22 days of ice. And so we're seeing lots of ice days being lost. And you see too in Gull Lake these years here where they really didn't have any substantial ice coverage and probably had no ice fishing those years. Because of course you need nice thick ice to walk out onto the lake. I wanted to grab a local example. So I reached out to the Grand Traverse Bay, the Watershed Center, and they provide the data. I apologize. I neglected to put the source in here, but it's from the Watershed Center at Grand Traverse. And this slide shows that similarly, you're seeing fewer and fewer days of ice coverage across time within Grand Traverse Bay. And then also these red lines show the frequency of ice-free years. And so you're also seeing that in addition to fewer days when there are ice, you have more years where there's no ice. And I know that there are vibrant, thriving ice fisheries going on Grand Traverse Bay for Cisco and lake trout and other fishes. And so this is a big deal. I've shown a few anecdotes, but of course, want to be able to provide a little bit more scientific evidence. And so there was a review of 9 Wisconsin lakes and 2 Ontario lakes, looking at their freezes and breakups. And the rate of change was such that their breakups were about 2 days or 0 to 2 days earlier in the spring, and their freezes were about 1 to 3 days later per decade. So every decade they're losing something like 1 to 5 days of ice on these lakes, which is consistent with the local examples from Michigan that I just showed. So what does that mean for fish and for plants? Water models are predicting that warm water seasons are going to be longer and warmer. So plants are going to have more time to grow, as will algae and zooplankton that live within the water column of lakes. And so for many plants and warm water fishes, this may increase growth. But importantly, it's not going to increase growth probably for cool or cold water fishes. And in situations where algae blooms dominate dominate the lake ecosystem, you're probably also not going to expect significant increases in submersed aquatic plant growth like these plants here. So we've got evidence that we've got warming water temperatures at the surface and deeper in the water. We've got longer growing seasons for aquatic plants, longer periods of stratification. So if you've ever swam in a lake and dove down deep into the lake, you'll notice that the water gets colder and colder and colder as you go down deeper. And during the summer in most lakes in Michigan, you have a stratification where the upper waters are circulating well and the bottom waters are circulating well. And each of those are circulating within each other, but are relatively isolated from each other. And so you have warm upper waters and cold lower waters. And that layer between it is called the thermocline, where the temperature changes quickly. And we're seeing that thermocline going deeper and deeper into lakes. Again, we're seeing shorter ice coverage, and then we're seeing changes in water levels and precipitation. And as I alluded to earlier, the changes in water levels and precipitation is kind of a mixed bag across the state. The models that I've seen and the data that I've seen show that we're seeing more precipitation, but we may be seeing other effects that are complicating those. And so, of course, right now, the state of Michigan is seeing record high water levels in the Great Lakes and across many inland lakes. The state of Wisconsin was seeing just recently low water levels and droughts. And these things, and the UP is in some drought right now as well. So these things are geographically complex, and I want to highlight and emphasize that climate change and its impacts may vary by the lake that we're talking about and by the region that your lake is in. And so we're expecting to see increased variation in water levels and precipitation. So we've reached the next break. And what I'd like to again emphasize is the points that I just made. We're seeing a lot of changes within the global climate system, and also within our lakes ecosystems based on climate change. So with that, I can take additional questions.
Just have a couple right now here, Joe. This is how can we convince decision makers about what may happen in the near future? I'm sure that means as far as climate change.
Well, I think there are, the main thing is to be communicating information to decision makers and communicating it in a way that conveys a clear message that decision makers who are not often scientists are able to hear and understand, that connects it to the things that we all value, and that isn't political, right? Nothing that I've said so far is Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative. As a state government employee, I'm intentionally not political, and none of this is political. All Michiganders are affected by our lakes, and all Michiganders are affected by our natural resources. And so, maintaining the science, preserving the science, and knowing that science then informs us on how we make political decisions, but it isn't the political decision itself, I think is a helpful way for me to compartmentalize and let the science lead our decisions.
Okay, a couple others. Does Michigan have long-term ice cover duration data for any inland lakes in the upper, lower, or upper peninsula?
I'm not aware of it, but I also haven't looked. So one of the things that I'd like to do is work with some researchers from the University of Michigan to try to put together similar data sets that I just showed on Gull and Fair Lakes in Berry County across the state, and see if we can put together some compelling data across the state. But I'm not aware of those data for UP lakes. Now, the data from the Wisconsin lakes that I showed a few slides previously, those data were from northern Wisconsin lakes that are darn near the UP. So might be a helpful surrogate.
Okay, one more. Is the high water levels in Michigan inland lakes good or bad for the fisheries?
I will get into that in the future, in the next section. So I think I'll come to that in a little bit here.
And that's it.
All righty. So the next section is how do these changes in climate and lakes affect fish habitat, fish populations, and fisheries? So the first thing is spawning timing. We've seen in the Great Lakes, for example, that yellow perch are spawning earlier. And if you know much about yellow perch biology, they spawn in the spring. They deposit their eggs on large woody habitat or aquatic vegetation. And then those eggs hatch, and the young, young of the year, go on to a period where they're feeding on zooplankton. Remember those little critters from before. All of these systems are very connected, and so when you have an earlier growing season beginning, you have earlier phytoplankton blooms. Phytoplankton are small algae that live in the water column and that take up nutrients from the water column, and they're single-celled organisms. And so those phytoplankton blooms occur earlier. And when those phytoplankton blooms occur earlier, then the next thing that happens is you see blooms in large-bodied zooplankton like Daphnia, which eat the phytoplankton. And so the perch are timing their reproduction so that those new offspring are growing up and are in that critical window when they're able to feed on those zooplankton. And so they're very much in tune with that change. And so we expect to see, things like yellow perch shifting their timing, and it's very possible that we'll see changes in other fish populations as well, as the word is phenology, the timing of their natural history events like spawning. And so then, Ralph, to your question on structural habitat, there's a really good example in Wisconsin. Here's a picture from Little Rock Lake South. And there was a famous study done in Little Rock Lake where they counted all of the large woody debris, these downed trees here, and they were looking at how does that affect fish populations and fish habitat. And under a drought scenario, drought conditions, what they saw is that as the water levels declined, the amount of woody habitat that was available for these fishes declined dramatically. They saw a 54% loss of coarse woody habitat through this natural experiment. And so that could have serious effects for fish populations which use that large woody habitat. For example, yellow perch, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass. On the other hand, if you see increased water levels that are flooding shorelines, you may see erosive forces being placed on shorelines that are not typically handling those sorts of wave energies and erosions. So you may see excess erosion and nutrient inputs to a lake. And so again, because we're looking at increased variation and variability within water levels, it's difficult to paint the whole state with a broad brush in terms of what we're going to see. But I think it's really important to consider the potential threats and negative effects from changing water levels to things like erosion and large woody debris. And so the next thing that I'll spend a fair amount of time on in terms of effects to fish is, of course, their thermal preferences and how changes in temperature affect fish. And so, the thing that we think of most often with climate change is warming temperatures. And temperatures are one of the really key drivers for which fish species live in a lake. And so here's a very simple infographic. We know that some fish like it warm. Here's a largemouth bass, for example, typically prefer warmer temperatures. And then you've got walleye, rainbow trout, sturgeon, brook trout, and all the way down here, lake trout. You could put burbot down here. And those fishes prefer it much colder. And so fisheries biologists refer to these fishes through their thermal guilds as cool, cold, and warm water fishes. It's a rough way to characterize fishes. And I've already used those a few times in this presentation. And we generally expect to see that we're going to see more warm water fishes and fewer cold water fishes as water temperatures warm. And models of fish habitat are starting to bear that out. So here's a really famous study by Gretchen Hansen and others on Wisconsin lakes. And they looked at the likelihood of presence for walleye or largemouth bass when they were taking into account lots of other factors within the lake, like the lake size and the trophic status, how many nutrients are in it, and those sorts of things. And what they found was that walleye, I better orient you to the graph. This x-axis here is the degree days. So in the summertime, as the summer lengthens and intensity of the heat increases, you accumulate degree days. And this is a similar measure to what we discussed when we're thinking about air conditioning, and power companies are plotting out how much air conditioning use is going to occur. They look at a certain threshold, say 70 degrees, and every day over that temperature, they count up, and the farther you are from that temperature, the more that day counts. And so it's a metric that pulls together the length of the growing season and also the heat of the growing season. And so what they saw was that as you have warmer temperatures and longer growing seasons, you tend to be more likely to have largemouth bass in your population and less likely to have walleye in your lake. But if you're in the cooler zone, you're more likely to have walleye and less likely to have largemouth bass. And there's a point here where those two flip-flop. We don't know the mechanisms for that, whether it's competition between the two species, whether one just does better in cold and one does better in warm, and there's no competition mediating the two. But it's a pretty clear signal across Wisconsin lakes. And of course, we can consider Wisconsin lakes as a pretty good analog for what we expect to see in Michigan. And so then Gretchen Hansen and others applied this model to all of their lakes, and they looked at predictions of growing degree days across time. So you've got present day, you've got 2040 to 2060, and you've got 2065 to 2080. And the number of bass-dominated lakes is expected to substantially increase, almost by, what would that be, 80% or so. The number of walleye-dominated lakes is supposed to go from 184 down to just 17 by the time my grandkids are fishing in Wisconsin. And so again, these are really, really significant changes in a fishery, and just as it is here in Michigan and Wisconsin, the walleye is a key fishery. Everybody talks about and wants to catch walleye. So this is a big deal. I want to use another example from a really well studied but potentially less familiar fish. And it's an example for a cold water fish, the Cisco. And so I've got a picture of a Cisco here just in case you're not familiar. Cisco are in the whitefish family, and they're high in fat, so they're a really good prey fish for top predators like lake trout and muskellunge and northern pike. Many of our trophy lakes here in Michigan and across the upper Midwest for those fishes are supported by Cisco populations that are providing really high-fat diets for those fishes. Cisco are a wildlife action plan priority for the state of Michigan. The wildlife action plan helps us to identify some of our priorities across the state for fish and wildlife species. And in general, Cisco are threatened by changing climates, but it's a little bit more complicated. And so I want to take this opportunity to go through some of the complexities, because I think they're valuable as we set up what our actions can be as concerned stakeholders moving into the future to combat the effects of climate change. So Cisco require cold, oxygenated water. Just remember that there's two things they need: cold and oxygen. And imagine you go out to the deepest part in a lake every day, all year long. And you drop down a temperature probe at multiple depths from the surface down to the bottom. And what you would see is that if you went out in May, you'd see slightly warmer temperatures toward the surface, these greener temperatures. But then as you dropped it all the way down to the bottom of the lake, in the middle of the lake, you would see fairly cold temperatures. And in May, the lake is pretty well mixed. As time progresses through the summer, let's say you go back out in July, and now you're starting to see temperatures in the 80-degree range. This is the lake setting up that stratification that we talked about earlier, where you've got warm waters that are mixing with themselves in the upper layer, and you've got cold waters that are mixing with themselves in the lower layer. And they're not really mixing between the two layers. Okay, so that's what the temperature profile looks like in July or August. It's getting pretty warm for Cisco up here, but they can still subsist in any of these cold bottom waters. And now you come into September and you've got the warm waters reach down a little bit lower into the lake, but there's still some habitat that the Cisco can access in the lake, especially down in the bottom. And then of course in the fall, as air temperatures cool and as wind blows across the lake becomes well mixed again and eventually cools off and probably freezes over. So that's the story for temperature within the lake. But of course, temperature isn't the only thing that Cisco need. They also need oxygen. And so this is what's happening with oxygen in the lake. In May, you have cool waters distributed throughout the lake that are mixing well, and you have dissolved oxygen in the water throughout the lake. But as you get to July, all of the phytoplankton and the dead and decaying organic matter, all of that biological activity that's occurring within the water column of the lake, that's settling out and falling down into the bottom of the lake. And it's decaying down in the bottom waters of the lake. And so that decay is sucking up oxygen from the bottom waters that aren't mixing with the surface waters. And so you see this red area is an area of low oxygen that's slowly creeping up and occupying more and more and more of the bottom waters of the lake. And it gets to the point where in September, for example, it's at its peak, and Cisco wouldn't be able to really occupy the bottom waters of the lake because there's not enough oxygen for them. And then of course, again, the lake becomes well mixed in the winter, in the fall and the winter, and the entire water column becomes available for Cisco. And so here are 4 pictorial examples of what's happening to Cisco in this lake at that time. First, you have Cisco that are well distributed across the water column vertically. So at the surface, at the bottom, they can be anywhere they want. And then in July, they start to get squeezed from the top by warm temperatures and from the bottom by these dissolved oxygen levels that are too low for them. And then in September, in some cases, there's no habitat that meets both the oxygen and the temperature criteria for the fish. And so they die. They become locally extinct, or what we call extirpated. And then of course, when the temperatures are again suitable for Cisco in November, you no longer have that population present. And so we see Cisco die-offs occurring in Michigan and across the upper Midwest. And there's been a ton of really, really top-notch research that's linked to those Cisco die-offs to this situation. And it's referred to as the oxythermal squeeze. So oxygen, temperature, squeezing the fish populations until the Cisco populations, until they can no longer persist. Now, I talked earlier about how all of these things, all of these factors at various spatial scales are affecting our lakes. Our lakes aren't just a function of what's occurring in front of the dock or even within the lake. And so, you know, we've already discussed, I'm going to go through an example from Minnesota. We've already discussed that the climate is warming, and this map just shows that the climate for lakes in Minnesota is warming. But we also have increased nutrients happening in lakes. And so the map on the right shows that watershed sources of nutrients to inland lakes in Minnesota are increasing unnaturally as a result of humans, and that there's a spatial distribution to those. Those things are happening more in the southern part of the state than they are in the northern part of the state. And those increased nutrients then are fueling more biological activity in the water column. And that biological activity, if you'll recall from the previous slide, is what drives the low oxygen levels that, that limit Cisco and other cold water fishes. So eutrophication and watershed changes are playing a huge part in interacting with climate change. And importantly, every lake has its own set of circumstances. So what I'm trying to convey is the complexity. If you were to take all of the lakes in Minnesota, for example, and plot out their change in their air temperature and their change in phosphorus, that's what this graph is showing. And let's just look at a few lakes. So you've got a lake in the northern part of Minnesota here in these green areas, the forested zone. Those would be analogous to our lakes in the UP or the northern lower peninsula. And so really, you know, you've got a lake going from here to here. So it's not changing as much in terms of its phosphorus, but it is changing a substantial amount in terms of its mean annual air temperature, which of course drives the water temperature. So the lake is getting warmer, not a lot more nutrients. Move up to the prairie zone within Minnesota. These are southern lakes that are more analogous to lakes around me here in Lansing. And you see substantial changes in phosphorus, right? So phosphorus going from here all the way over to here. Big increase in phosphorus, still an increase in temperature, but the main thing that's going on in this lake is a phosphorus increase. And then of course in the transition zone in the middle, so think like the Clare region of Michigan, you're seeing this, you're seeing changes in both axes. And so what I want to really convey, if you take nothing from this slide, is that every lake has a complex set of circumstances that are changing its habitat a little bit differently than the other lakes around it, but that we can understand what's happening through models and through other regional inquiries like this. Okay, well, how does that affect fish? Fish are the thing that I started this presentation as our motivating factor, and that's what I want to come back to. So let's again think about air temperature and phosphorus. So we've got phosphorus increasing along the x-axis here, and along the y-axis we've got increasing air temperatures. And this plot is now looking at the likelihood of finding largemouth bass in a Minnesota lake that meets these criteria. And so if you're in a Minnesota lake with 10 milligrams per liter of phosphorus and 3 degrees Celsius mean annual air temperature, you're relatively unlikely to see a largemouth bass. But if you're in that same lake that's a little bit warmer in the 7-degree range, then you're much more likely to see a largemouth bass in that lake. Because largemouth bass prefer this area in the white where there's warmer temperatures but relatively low phosphorus. And really they're tolerant of increasing phosphorus up to a certain amount. But it's those cold temperatures that tend to exclude them. They don't do so well in. Okay, so that's one fish, but we know that our lakes are complex ecosystems that contain many fishes. So think about this graph, but now we've got that same figure for 25 different fishes. And of course, you could make this same figure for every fish if you wanted to. And so researchers in Minnesota looked at the thermal along the y-axis and the phosphorus along the x-axis preferences for all of these different fishes. And you may see some in here that make sense to you. You know, for example, let's see. channel catfish, like warm, high phosphorus locations. You've got white suckers that prefer cold temperatures here on the bottom. Walleye prefer cold temperatures. Rock bass prefer cold, clear water. So you can imagine that very quickly how we think climate change is going to affect fish populations is going to be a very complex thing to predict. And it's going to depend on which fishes are in the lake and lots of interactive terms among these fish populations, because of course northern pike are eating white suckers, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just want to emphasize that as we move forward into a new climate, one of the things that we have to be ready for is that we're going to encounter unknown situations. And we're not going to have the ability to predict with perfect accuracy all of the effects that are going to permeate out from the various climate models, et cetera, because these are such complicated systems. And so we have to be ready for surprises and ready to adaptively manage in that context. Okay, so one thing that I'd like to do is pull up an example from the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership that helps provide a little bit more information about lakes in Michigan. And so I've gone to a website. This is, you can just reach this at midwestglaciallakes.org. And if you go to this website, you can see a map of all of the lakes in Michigan and the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnerships region over to the Dakotas. But we'll focus on Michigan here. So you've got all the lakes in Michigan. I believe you're talking about 6,500 lakes, 10 acres or larger. Let's first just sort the lakes so that we're only showing lakes that are 50 acres or larger. And that winnows it down quite a bit. We have most of our lakes are those small lakes, as is the case across the upper Midwest. And then we can look at those lakes by different disturbance types. So we can look at them based on the disturbance to the watershed, how much agriculture and urban development is in the watershed, how much agriculture and urban development, including shoreline development, is in the shoreline. And then we can also look at their climate vulnerability. And here the climate vulnerability is based on models that were created for fish species across the upper Midwest, across this region, for bluegill, northern pike, walleye, and then cold water fishes generally. And then we looked at whether a particular lake was likely to lose one of those cold water fishes. So if it is likely to lose a cool or cold water fish like northern pike, walleye, or a cold water species, then we deemed it climate vulnerable, highly vulnerable. And so what you can see here is that in Michigan, we have a lot of climate vulnerable lakes. Those are those red lakes. I'm going to change the transparency so they show up a little bit better. And you see a lot of lakes in the northern lower and the UP that are likely to lose a fish species. So I'm going to zoom in since this is a Traverse City centric audience. I'm going to zoom into that area and we'll just sort of take a step back and look at general patterns. You see that there's a mix of lakes, and it really depends as much on what's happening with the regional climate as it does with the individual characteristics of a particular lake. I want to emphasize that these models are really good at telling us general patterns across the region, but that the experience of that lake into the future for one particular lake may differ because those lakes are the replicates for this model. And it's a statistical distinction that gets a little bit wonky, but I want to, the fact that the prediction may not be perfect for a particular lake, the model is calibrated so that it's helpful in understanding patterns across the region and across all of the lakes. And so in general, the results are informative, but they're not perfect. And so you could then go through the exercise of looking at lakes across Michigan and looking at whether they're vulnerable to climate change. You could filter them then by watershed disturbance. So I've already talked a little bit about watershed as a mitigating and mediating factor for lake health under climate change scenarios. And so let's say you only want to see the low watershed disturbance lakes. So these are the lakes with just low watershed disturbance, and they're red if they have high climate vulnerability, or blue if they have low climate vulnerability. And you could also look at the lakes with low shoreline disturbance. Oh, excuse me, I've done it backwards. Now it's showing the low watershed and low shoreline disturbance lakes. And so you can winnow down and select lakes based on a variety of criteria here within the state, county, etc. So I think this software, this website, helps us to learn a little bit more about a particular lake. Let's say Lake Skegamog has low watershed disturbance, low shoreline disturbance, and high vulnerability for climate change. But it also helps us to understand what's happening to our population of lakes across the state, which is something that I'm especially concerned with given statewide coverage of fish habitat for Michigan lakes. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this website, to go check it out. Okay. I think folks should be able to see the slides again. Please interrupt me if that's not the case. So we've talked about fish habitat, we've talked about fish populations, and I want to just finish off the fish discussion by talking about how does this affect fishing. Okay, so we expect to see fewer and smaller populations of cool and cold water fishes, like brook trout, brown trout, burbot, lake trout, northern pike, and walleye. We expect to see more warm water fishes like bluegills, catfishes, and largemouth bass. You know, any of those panfish and centrarchids we're probably going to see more of. Fewer days of ice fishing, and then earlier fishing for fish that are bed spawners like largemouth bass and panfishes. People often fish for those while they're spawning, and so they'll be targeting them earlier and earlier, most likely. Whew. Okay, so that was the effects to fish and fish habitat and to our lakes from climate change. And just taking a step back, if you got lost in the details and the weeds of my presentation, the take home is we're expecting to see fewer cool and cold water fishes, more warm water fishes, and that these complex interactions with other factors in the watershed, along the shoreline, and within the fish community in the lake are going to make things a little bit unpredictable, and so we have to be ready for those surprises. So with that, I'll take a moment for some questions. Hopefully you don't feel like this guy here. We're almost to the finish line, and we're going to get through this together. It's going to get less wonky moving forward.
All right, thank you, Joe. Yes, a couple of questions here. I believe this goes back to when you were talking about the perch and their spawning and the zooplankton and Daphnia and then the phytoplankton and that timing. Do you mean that the fish will intentionally shift their timing of breeding to adjust for this change?
Yes, a really good clarification, and one that I was thinking about but didn't go into while I discussed it. We cannot know what a fish is thinking or not thinking. I've never had a conversation with a fish, and so it's impossible for us to say that the fish, what the fish's intent was. All we can determine and observe is what the fish are doing. And what we have observed is that in this case, yellow perch are spawning earlier. And we have also observed that yellow perch reproduction and year class strength, the the success and survival of their offspring is highly connected to these zooplankton blooms. And so it's a consistent explanation for why ecological fitness is improved by those fish spawning earlier. But in terms of the mechanism, is it that early spawners are surviving better than late spawners? Or is it that, so is there a genetic component, or is it a temperature mediated component that those fish are just queuing on when the lake hits X degrees spawn? Those things are less clear. Thank you, that's a really good question.
Another question is, how will fishing regs be adjusted given changing climate and changing fisheries?
Ralph is one step ahead of me today. So I'm going to cover that in the what can we do section.
Sounds good. And and also Ralph added that he had a one-way conversation with trophy fish that got away. So
yeah, I've been there.
yeah.
Okay, so we're on the home stretch. I've tried to talk through some of the changes we expect to see in our lakes, in our climate, and to our fish and fisheries. Now, what can we do, right? You know, for the folks that have tuned in this morning, and then for the folks that are watching this video later on, we're here because we care about our lakes and we want to do something. What can we do? It's a little bit daunting. And so I'm going to try to walk through it, but know that I empathize with the feeling that we've got a tall task in front of us. We have to be really strategic about where we put our efforts, and also understand that we're not going to be able to solve the entire thing. We're not going to miss and mitigate all of the effects of climate change. So our best strategy is going to be to do what we can to minimize climate change, and to then minimize the effects to our resources that we care about. So if you remember way back at the beginning of our presentation, I presented this slide where I talked about climate, watersheds, shorelines, and inland lake habitat are all interconnected with people and with fish and with each other, and that this system is a complex system. And we can take advantage of these interactions as we think about the effects of a changing global climate and how that percolates down through the watersheds and the shorelines to fish and to other things that we care about. And we could try to identify those levers that we can pull to make some changes to get the benefits that we want strategically. So I'll go through some of those, but just keep in mind this diagram, and I'll highlight it in the top here. So what can we do to address changes in the climate? This is the big one. That's the largest mountain that's difficult to climb, the largest pile of snow to shovel, continuing the analogy from a couple slides before. Minimizing our greenhouse gas emissions is difficult, and we're all only one person. And so, I doubt the President of the United States is signing on to my webinar, or the President of the the leader of the UN, or any other global leaders. I'm not signaling out anybody in particular, but my point is we only have limited control typically over the things that we can do. But it's important to do those things. And so each of us individually, can minimize our greenhouse gas emissions by doing things like driving less, by limiting our use of two-stroke engines, which emit lots of other greenhouse gases in addition to carbon dioxide, by choosing renewable energy sources and supporting energy efficiency policies. And you can do much more. And so I'm a fisheries biologist. I'm not an energy use specialist, but the EPA has a really good website on reducing the environmental impact of your energy use. And if you want to learn more about how to do those sorts of things, I recommend you can Google that, and you can get to their website pretty quickly. and learn about your own carbon footprint and how you can do your part to minimize your carbon footprint. So we should all do our part to minimize climate change, and that's referred to as mitigation. But then there are a number of other steps that we can do that fall into what is generally classified as adaptation, and that is minimizing the effects of climate change that's going to occur. As I mentioned earlier, even under a low emissions scenario, we're still going to see effects of climate change. And so we need to think about a strategy that includes both reducing our emissions and minimizing the effects of greenhouse gas, of climate change to our systems that we care about. So let's think about watersheds first. We talked in the cool and cold water fishes section a lot about how nutrients and excess nutrients to lakes can increase, can decrease the dissolved oxygen levels in those cold bottom waters, and as a result, those are limiting the habitability of those lakes for fishes. And of course, those increased nutrient levels also decrease water clarity, which decrease property values. And so there are a lot of reasons why we should be looking at protecting and restoring our forests, our wetlands, and our other natural land cover types in our watersheds. But climate change adds an additional component to that because it helps us to create more resilient ecosystems moving into the future, especially for those systems that contain cool and cold water fishes presently. So how do we do that? This is going into a realm that actually Steve and the Grand Traverse Conservation District are going to be much more adept at than a fisheries biologist like me. But you can use things like easements, conservation easements to encourage the application of best management practices for nutrients, to minimize the runoff of nutrients. You can acquire land for protection. A lot of land conservancies are doing this, for example. You can manage buffer strips along the shorelines and riparian zones, the near water zones for streams and lakes, and those intercept nutrients. And so all of these strategies can help to minimize nutrients coming from the watershed and thus increase the resilience of the lake. Second, you can improve the ability for fish to migrate among habitats. So if you have a fish population that becomes locally extirpated, but is connected to another lake that can act as a source to essentially restock that lake, then that might be a really critical migratory corridor to improve. Similarly, fish's ability to access all of the habitats that they need throughout their lives, whether those are wetlands or streams or other lakes, are really critical. And again, removing these barriers, whether it's a road stream crossing in a culvert that the fish can't get past, whether it's a dam, even including lake level control structures that are at the outlets of many inland lakes, thinking about ways that fish can get past those structures is a really critical component of a holistic resilience strategy for climate change for a lake. So next, on the shoreline, what can you do on the shoreline? If you're a riparian property owner listening to this, you can manage your property to be lake friendly. What does that mean? You can assess how lake friendly your property is through the Michigan Shoreland Stewards Program. I've got a link to the program here on my website. I'm not going to go into it in detail. You can find it if you Google my Shoreland Stewards pretty easily. And this will assess your property, the upland, the buffer zone near the water, the shoreline zone right at the water, and then the in-lake habitat. And it'll help to give you some tailored recommendations for what you can do to better manage the nutrients and the habitat for wildlife and fish on your property. So this is a really good start. Some of the examples that you would see in there would be things like using no-mow zones near the shoreline to allow that buffer of vegetation to intercept runoff and nutrients, removing seawalls and potentially storing natural shorelines. And then if you've done those things, talk with the folks around your lake. Becoming a proponent for natural shorelines on your lake through the Michigan Shoreland Stewards Ambassador Program is another option. So this is essentially a toolkit for people within the Shoreland Stewards Program to reach out to other folks within their lake or in their community to help promote being a shoreline steward. And one of the tools that you could consider using is a Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership booklet called Shoreline Living. And this shows, going back to what I was discussing earlier, our social norms really drive what we decide to do with the management of our properties. And so showing examples of beautiful properties with natural shorelines is a really powerful way to convince people that it doesn't have to look unkempt and it doesn't have to look unruly. It could be that you have a natural shoreline that is entirely protected and looks like a forest, or you could have a natural shoreline that looks like the cover here, for example, and looks more like a garden. And all of those have function and have roles. And so this booklet provides some really nice pictures and stories of folks that have installed or maintained natural shorelines on their properties and have reduced the nutrients and increased the wildlife habitat and fish habitat as a result. So I recommend checking that out. You can Google Shoreline Living. It's a product of the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership. And on the website, you can also access all of the pictures and use them for presentations or mailers for your lake association if you want as well. So highly recommend checking that out. And then, of course, within the lake, what can we do? The first thing I'd say is not removing native plants. Native plants are really critical for improving the water clarity and water quality within your lake, and they provide habitat and refuge for fish and wildlife. And people pay tens of thousands of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars to remove native plants in their lakes across Michigan. So maintaining your native plant populations. Adding or at least not removing fallen trees and branches in the water. Again, we alluded to this earlier. And there's a really good manual for this. If you decide that you want to add fallen trees to the water, coarse woody habitat is the technical term. There's a manual for that in the Fish Sticks manual provided by Wisconsin. And it gives you lots of technical advice on how exactly to fell a tree and to make sure that it stays put in front of your house or in the property that you've identified it to be placed at. And I again would just reinforce that if you're going to be attempting a project like this, that it would need to have a permit from Eagle. And then, of course, planting trees along shorelines to reinforce the shoreline with their root systems and as a future source for woody habitat. Because if we have fewer trees along the shoreline now, then in 100 years when all of those trees are grown up and dying and falling naturally, we'll see those declines. So there's a lag built into the system, and we need to keep our recruitment of the large woody debris. We need to keep that pipeline going by planting more trees along our shorelines as well. So those are some things that we can do in the lake itself. But I mentioned, of course, that these are connected systems and that people are really at the heart of a lot of these things. And so, becoming a proponent through the Natural Shoreline Stewards Ambassador Program, using the Shoreline Living booklet, and preventing aquatic invasive species in your lake. And I've got a website here that provides more information on aquatic invasive species prevention. These are things that you can do concretely on your lake to work with the people around your lake to improve the resiliency relative to climate change. And then finally, fish. I promised Ralph I didn't forget your question. For fish, there are a handful of options that we could consider. The first would be to just go ahead and stock more fish in a lake if the fish population is lower than desirable. And I would say that, in many cases, that's going to be a Band-Aid solution. If the habitat isn't there to support that fish population, then stocking more fish is unlikely to establish a new healthy population of fishes. And so you're going to probably end up either having to come back and stocking it over and over again repeatedly, because, for example, maybe the fish can't reproduce in that lake, or you're going to find that you don't meet the expectations of the initial stocking. And so, so this is a short-term solution. One area where it might be helpful in the longer term is assisted migration. And so if there are waters that become newly suitable to fish species that didn't have access to that water, then one option to consider would be assisted migration. And that's an area where the Department of Natural Resources and other agencies really haven't done a lot of, quite frankly, thinking or policy development. And so it's a new idea and suggestion coming out in the literature and that sort of thing, but we haven't come to a firm policy stance on that yet. Then you could change regulations. So of course, there are limits on how many fish you can catch, what sizes of fish you can catch, how many you can keep per day, those sorts of things. And you could consider limiting the take of cool and cold water fishes. And that's a decision that would be made by our fisheries biologists in our management units. And so that's a potential solution. And there's a really nice paper that came out last year, Adapting to Climate Change, Guidance for the Management of Inland Glacial Lake Fisheries in Lake and Reservoir Management. This is a peer-reviewed journal. And so if you're interested in learning more and some full tables, I'm showing here an example of the tables. They've got a really exhaustive list of a lot of the best ideas on resiliency for climate change. Then I recommend reading through that paper. And I, of course, didn't have the time to go into all the detail that I'd like to today, but it's a valuable read. And then I want to leave you, I've listed out a number of types of projects and activities that a motivated stakeholder might want to take on, but I want to leave you also with the understanding that there are resources available for stakeholders and for property owners to get started on these things. And so the first, of course, as a DNR fisheries employee is reaching out to your local DNR fisheries biologist. We've got fisheries biologists across the state, and they're willing to help and knowledgeable about specific lakes, much more knowledgeable than I am. And so they can help with those conversations. The DNR has a fisheries habitat grant that can assist with habitat restoration and protection projects. And so it's worth looking into the DNR fisheries habitat grant. The Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy has a non-point source grant. And their staff, of course, are very helpful in making sure your lake is set up with the proper assessments needed and pre-work needed to effectively target a project and then to acquire these funds and to help mitigate nutrients in a lake's watershed. So again, I highly recommend this as a source of funding. The Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership has a lakes conservation grant. This is a smaller funding source, but potentially an option as well. Notably, it doesn't allow for acquisition of land, but it can help with some of the nutrient issues, some of the assessment studies that you might need to do to get started on a project or to do education and outreach, etc. And then, of course, the Natural Resources Conservation Service operates a number of very, very large conservation grant programs, and the Conservation District staff. And I can't highlight this one enough. This is a really critical one for getting conservation done along shorelines and especially in watersheds. So I highly recommend looking into these programs. And finally, nonprofit staff such as Watershed Council staff are really good resources to help you get started. Often they've been thinking about and been working on projects on lakes around the state or around the watershed. And so it's a great place to start and to plug into existing activities as opposed to reinventing the wheel in some cases. And Michigan State Extension provides a number of staff that also have expertise here. So there's some good resources out there, and I encourage folks to take advantage of those if you want to get started down the right path, because as I said, these things are complex. There are lots of interactions to consider, and bringing in professionals to help guide you and guide your lake through increasing resilience to climate change is going to be the best strategy. Whew. We've made it to the end. I've taken some liberties in terms of going into a lot of detail on particular subjects, especially climate and fish habitat. Hopefully you've found those useful and informative. And so, I just want to sort of re-emphasize some of the points that we made initially. Fish habitats, of course, include all of these various characteristics, and they're connected to human and ecological systems. And so it's a bit myopic to just think about fish habitats in terms of, for example, downed trees or aquatic vegetation or a brush bundle. You need to think about the entire ecosystem, really. And we're seeing lots of changes to our lakes based on changes in climate. And those changes are occurring in the context of changes from increased nutrients, from shoreline development, et cetera, et cetera. And so we expect to see fewer cool and cold water fishes across the state, more warm water fishes, and we expect to see some surprises that we're going to have to be ready for. And so we need to partner to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce nutrients and minimize other threats in the watershed, on the shoreline, and in the lake. So with that, I am going to put my contact information on the slide here. And I'm going to just let the program scroll through some pictures from the Shoreline Living booklet that I mentioned earlier. And I, again, recommend, if you are interested in using that booklet in your outreach activities, to go check it out on the website. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. It's a great presentation. One writer said MSU's Introduction to Lakes course is another great resource for shoreline management. So just wanted to get that out there.
Yeah, agreed.
And the fish habitat grant through the state, is that still on hold because of the state budget crisis right now?
Yes, so the DNR Fisheries Habitat Grant is on hold due to the Executive Directive 2020-03 currently. And as are many state grant programs. Typically, we announce the request for proposals for what would be the 2020 grant cycle at the end of July. And so we're still awaiting direction from above, from the directors within the DNR, and really looking at the state's budget for FY 2021 as we try to figure out what's going to happen for the next fiscal year, because we're expecting huge shortfalls as a state government. So yeah, short answer is yes, it is still on hold. We don't have a lot of information right now, but we're hopeful that there will be a grant cycle in 2020 and 2020, that would fund projects in May or so of 2021. And if folks have questions or are wanting to be aware of that grant when it comes out, the DNR newsletter and digest shares the information about the grant. So that's where you can learn about the request for proposals. You can also learn about it on the website, on the DNR website.
Thank you. Another question here. These grant programs seem to be focused on priority lakes and watersheds. How about small grants for individual lakefront property owners?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's spot on that most of the larger grant programs that we see right now are geared toward relatively large problems. And when I say large, I mean at one site. And so there aren't there's a really good example in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Healthy Lakes Initiative, where their state government and their Department of Natural Resources operates a small grants program where lakefront property owners can get something on the order of $1,000 to $2,000 to install very manageable, often do-it-yourself type projects like a rain garden or a small plant garden or like a pollinator garden, that is, or a large weighted debris installation. And those have been pretty successful and popular in Wisconsin. And so that's something that we might consider here in the state of Michigan, that is. But I'm not aware of any programs like that to date. Of course, a lake association or another group could bundle together projects like that and apply for some of the funding sources that I discussed earlier. And I know in the Midwest Glacial Lakes Partnership, we've funded projects like that. On the Wright Lake with a compelling bundle of projects, I could see what the Fisheries Habitat Grant project funding a project like that. So it would take coordination, but in terms of one-off projects, I'm not aware of many grants that are available right now. They may be out there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Patty unless there's any other questions. I don't see any that have come in, so I'm going to turn it over to Patty and then Carol.
Hello, my name is Patty Hertzberger, and I'm part of the Spider Lake, Runny Lake team that helped organize the poll series. We're glad that you were able to join us today, and we hope that we were able to share some information that was new to you. And we are fortunate to have Dr. Joe Nohner with us today in webinar format, and appreciate him sharing not only his time, but also his vast knowledge of inland lake fish, their habitats, and how the climate is affecting both. So to show our appreciation, the team would like to present Dr. Nohner with this year's Advice from a Lake t-shirt from Your True Nature Store. A tree was also purchased and donated to be planted in a very deserving area. So the poem on the t-shirt reads, "Advice from a lake, be clear, make positive ripples, look beneath the surface, stay calm, shore up friendships, and take time to reflect and be full of life." Thank you very much, and we appreciate everyone being here and everyone that helped today to put this series on. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Carol.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you to the organizers of this event.
Steve, could you put up on the screen references to the past poll series and the one coming up, please? Thank you.
Is it up? Not yet? Hang on.
Yes, if you can move it over a little and take away the...
If you need to put it in full presentation mode.
Okay,
Perfect.
you can see it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Wow. I certainly learned a lot about fisheries and fish habitat and the changes that are affecting both of those. I hope everyone that attended it with us today and those that watch it in the future on webinar do too. As a person who doesn't fish, I came to this topic with the idea in mind, with the analogy in mind of Rachel Carlson's study back in 1963 and ending up in the booklet Silent Spring, that what she found to generalize what she found was that pesticides were not only killing the insects in our backyards, but all of the songbirds that were eating those insects were also dying off. Thus, there was a silent spring without the songs of those backyard birds. So a simple summary of her study in the book Silent Spring. But now after Dr. Joe Nohner's presentation on fish and fish habitat, wow, it's just so much more complex. It's not the example on the Cisco species of the oxythermal squeeze where the oxygen and the temperature is affecting those fish, but it's the shorelands and how they're affecting it, the rainfall, the ice cover, again, the temperature and the oxygen in the water, and then the temperature of the water, and then how those are affecting the plant growth, and then how the plant growth is increasing the nutrients and the phosphorus, and then how that's affecting the fish and the fish habitat, and then how all the different species of fish are challenged or perhaps helped because of all these changes. So Dr. Joe Nohner referred to the complexity of this. Boy, put that complexity in capital letters and largest font, and that's what we've got here. So keep that all in mind as you go out and enjoy your waters today. So let's proceed to the next PowerPoint presentation. So thank you everyone for attending today. We, Patty, Ralph, and I, and the Grand Traverse Conservation District all hope that you'll join us for the next one on August 15th. It's another Saturday morning. That one will tie in very much with some of the recommendations that Dr. Joe Nohner has given us today about protecting our shorelands and shorelines. Eric Elgin is with the MSU Extension program and I've heard him speak before, another dynamic speaker. So please consider registering for that. Also, if you want to refer back to today's presentation or the first presentation on the underwater forests and aquatic plants, go to the Grand Traverse Conservation District's website and find links for both of those there. Those of you that have registered will also receive a email from the Conservation District that will give you that link. Otherwise, again, go to their website. And while you're at their website, please consider, if you appreciate this kind of programming and the other programming that they do, please consider a donation to continue these kinds of programs in the future. So in the tradition of our poll series, I want to conclude with a small takeaway, not just the analogy to Silent Spring and the pesticides and the songbirds, but also even more simplistically, the canaries in the mines or the canaries in the coal mines. When you're out there enjoying your waters, your favorite water spots, your favorite watering or fishing hole, consider not just whether you're going to get the big one that day or that time, but consider all of those complexities that Dr. Joe Nohner has shared with us. And consider at least one of the ways that he suggested that we could be part of the solution to maintaining or improving our fish and fish habitats. So make some positive ripples in your choices and in your recreation. Thank you for attending. And thank you to, again, the Grand Traverse Conservation District for hosting the poll series this year. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Dr. Nohner.